in the long term, large language models, to the degree which they're using training sets based off large volume, I don't think it's going to kill writing. I think there's still tremendous opportunity for people to distinguish themselves with writing and storytelling. I think it's more like the evolution of fast food did not kill the Michelin star restaurant, and the evolution of ready-to-wear clothes did not kill haute couture. It's going to be like that. There's going to be a large volume of poorly written stuff, and there's going to be an opportunity for people who write well to distinguish themselves.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities, and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets?
Welcome back to our final episode of Summer Playlist 2024 on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greeley, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Ted Merz, founder of Principles Media. We'll be discussing the growing imperative for business leaders to be able to tell their and their company's story, and how technology is changing the nature of how we write our stories and what our readers value in them. Hello, Ted. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
David, it's good to be here again.
Oh, it's good to have you here. Last time you were here, we talked a lot about information. And what I wanted to talk with you about this time was about one of the most important ways that we give meaning to that information, and that's through story and storytelling. And I really enjoy reading the stories you write, Ted, which are very much about individuals and, I don't know, maybe like small moments or interesting experiences. And I'd like to begin by asking you, what drew you to this style of writing? Why storytelling?
That's a good question. I'm going to tell you, when I was really little, my parents would take me to church, and I would take out the pencil in the pew, the paper telling you what hymns to sing.
I remember it.
And I would take notes and write stories about the sermon and the minister. It's just something that just comes out. I mean, I just have always, since a young age, felt compelled to ask a lot of questions and then want to write about people that I was talking to. I can't explain it, but it's always been a drive for me. It became my career and it became a business, but it is literally what I would do. If I were retired, I would walk around, try to meet people and write about them. Most of the people I write about are people I meet, but I do sometimes write about famous people or historical people and try to tell a story around that. It just kind of is something that comes naturally.
There's a lot written on how to tell stories well. I want to get your thoughts on your approach to that. But I also wanted to ask you, how do you find the stories that are worth telling?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two parts to that answer. And one is a practical, sort of tactical, and the other is more deciding what to write about. So I'll start with the second. I think the best stories are stories where people relate to the story in some way, but there's some new element to it. It's somewhat understandable, but it's also somewhat new. And I'll give you an example of that. I wrote a story today on my newsletter about Ernest Hemingway. So everybody knows about Ernest Hemingway, very famous writer, maybe one of the most famous to this last century. And he wrote a book called A Movable Feast, which was his observations of his years when he was in his 20s and he lived in Paris as an expatriate. So that's immediately relatable. Most people know the author. Most people know the book. What I came across in reading was a story about how the book came to be. And the book came to be because Hemingway took notes in his 20s when he lived in Paris, and he put them in a steamer trunk, and he stored it at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. And he left Paris and he went to Spain and he did the bullfighting and he wrote books in Spain. He went to Italy. He went to Cuba. He spent 30 years living, he went to Africa. And he came back to Paris when he was in his late 50s, super famous, super accomplished. And he's staying at the Ritz. And the manager of the Ritz said, Mr. Hemingway, you left a steamer trunk here 30 years ago. They get the trunk out. In the trunk are all his notebooks from the 20s. So he wrote the book based on the notebooks that he had. And there's a couple of things there that I think are interesting. The first is it's just a great story. And you realize that this book, one of his more famous books, would never have happened except for this quirk of fate that he happened to go back, happened to stay at the Ritz. The manager happened to bring it up, and he discovered his old notebooks. So that, to me, when you ask how do you find a good story, I think good stories are things which, there's something new there that most people don't know that story about the notebooks and the steamer trunk, but most people know about Hemingway. So it's relatable, but then also new. I think for me, those stories are most effective or impactful. The other thing I would say about the story, when I wrote it, I took a lesson away from that story. And the lesson was you should write things down. You should use notebooks. And so my post was a little bit about, hey, there's this great story about Hemingway, but there's also a bit of a life lesson here about taking notes and keeping track and learning from it. And that leads me to the second point. When you say, how do you find these stories? The first is finding it. The second is executing it. And for me, I do a lot of note-taking along the way. And so I have reams of notebooks, online Google Docs, where I have observations or things I've learned. Maybe you said something to me and it's really interesting, and I'll write it down now. And that'll become a story a year from now, 5 years from now, sometime, I don't know. But so I think it's, if you don't have a bit of a system in terms of gathering information and keeping it somewhere, it's hard to then take advantage of it later in a story. So it's a combination of knowing a good story, but also having gathered a lot of the information.
I love that story and I love that answer because it's working on a number of different levels, right? Like there's the relatability of knowing Hemingway. There's also the relatability of, we all have had the experience of you're cleaning out a closet or going through boxes in the attic and you find something, maybe it was from when you were in college or, your younger days, and it just brings back all these memories of a time that you had forgotten. And if you hadn't written it down, you never would have remembered it. And kind of relate to Hemingway having that experience of discovering this old steamer trunk with his journals from years earlier and all that coming back.
The other thing about that Hemingway story, I read it. So the first thing I thought when I picked up the book, and this was spurred because I happened to pick up that book, and I assumed he wrote it in his 20s. And when I read the preface, I was shocked that he wrote it right before he died in his late 50s, like early 60s. And I was like, that's insane. How did he remember all those things? So part of the interesting thing to me was like, also that he wrote it so late. I thought that was really surprising.
Yeah, and he was able to put himself a little bit back more, maybe into that younger version of himself.
Yeah, he could remember it. So I think it's important to have a practice of gathering notes and writing down observations. You try to think about stories which make you excited, but which also think of the audience and think of, will people understand this? So the Hemingway story works a little bit better because it's Ernest Hemingway, as opposed to a writer no one's ever heard of. Then you'd be like, okay, it doesn't have the same impact.
And I guess it's like a challenge, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about was storytelling has really become much more popular in the business world. Whereas in the past, I'm old enough to remember when, that was seen a little bit as unprofessional and a more detached style was the norm. And people who are more artists, writers, might be more relatable. In some sense, it seems like storytelling can be more challenging in the business world. And I wanted to ask you, do you agree that storytelling has become much more popular in the business world? And if so, why do you think the change in the style of writing that readers want when it comes to the business world?
Those are really good questions. I'd have to say 100%. We're seeing more executives and businesses use storytelling to get their message out. I'd also say I'm really surprised by that. On one level, we shouldn't be surprised because we've been, as humans, telling stories since Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. It goes way back. On the other hand, I think it's shocking when I read through Twitter or X now or read LinkedIn, so much of the content are stories about business people. I just don't think if you had said 10 years ago, you're going to read Twitter and it's going to be all these long stories about how Warren Buffett built his business and how various people succeeded. I don't think you would have predicted that. But in fact, you see that. And I think you see more and more of it. And I think it's because people realize it's effective. And it's the way our brains process information. If you give me a list of facts and figures it's very hard to remember. If those facts and figures are woven into a narrative with actors and villains and heroes and protagonists, then I can remember it. I can remember the action. I remember that Ernest Hemingway's steamer trunk at the Ritz. And then that helps me remember the lesson of, I should take notes and keep them in notebooks and all. But if I had just written a post that says, hey, it's a great idea to write down your observations in a notebook, it doesn't go anywhere. I think on the one hand, I'm surprised by it, but on the other hand, we shouldn't be, because people are trying to drive to communicate and people are trying to get their message out. And so probably people started writing things like, hey, you should take notes. It's a good practice. And then you realize that just doesn't land. It's not memorable. So the stories around this information is what makes it memorable. And that's, I think, why we're seeing more and more of it. But I think we're honestly just in the first inning. I think there's so much more to come. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting. Look, one of the things, you didn't say it explicitly, but I write online on social media. Social media has democratized the distribution of that information. So before, I would have had to find a publisher and someone would have vetted what I decided to write, or the fact that there is no barrier to writing. It allows a lot more people to post their stories. And so people get discovered that way and you can share information. And so I think it's quite amazing that it's happening. And I just think we're going to see a lot more of it, honestly.
It's making me think, when you brought up the point of so many stories about business leaders, in a certain sense, they become like the aspirational figures of our time. If you went back a number of years, maybe it would be people aspired to be a movie star or a celebrity, or years before that, a military hero or a great athlete. And like those others, it seems like today readers want more of that direct access to their aspirational figures, whether it's a movie star or a business leader. They want that direct connection. They don't want the filtering through traditional media. And authenticity is valued very highly. Perhaps that's the most highly valued thing for readers these days. And I was wondering, how can business leaders tell their story and their company's story in an authentic way?
It's both really easy and really hard. So the easy part is this: to be authentic, you should not try to be something. You should just be something. And that's it. Now, that's easier said than done, but I'll explain what I mean in an example. I think if you go back 10 years, a lot of CEOs would have said to their communications departments, their PR staff, I want to be seen as an environmentalist. I want to be seen as a tech expert. I want to be seen as this or that, okay? And that's where you run into trouble, because when you approach the exercise in that way, I want to be viewed this way. If you're not that thing, people can sense it and feel it, and it is not authentic. It's usually not authentic anyway. There's an element of kind of pre-planning, or there's an element of almost strategy that people sense and they can feel. So the way I explain it when I talk to customers, people will say, I want to be an environmentalist, so let's write a story about how the environment's important. I say, you can't do that. You can write a story about how you canoed down the Amazon, and people can draw the conclusion that you're an environmentalist, and that's fine. If you talk about how the Amazon's important, that's not going to work. So people have a very fine meter for detecting BS. The key to writing online and being authentic is to tell stories about things you've done and tell me what you learned from it or what you thought about it. I think that's a way to think. Don't tell me you think the Amazon is important. Tell me what you did. I canoed down the Amazon, and this is what I learned about the fragile ecosystem or whatever. And I think if people talk about what they've done specifically, they're always in a better shape, and they're always going to be perceived more authentically, because they are. They're not trying to tell you what they think or who they want you to think they are. But it's very hard to do that. Most people, it goes against a lot of grains. It goes against a lot of what we were taught earlier in our careers.
Yeah, and there seems to be the big piece as well, right? There's always the trap of trying to tell someone what you think they want to hear so that they'll see you as you want to be seen.
Yes, I think this has been a huge communication shift in our lifetime. I think companies 20 years ago, the idea was we don't want to make anyone angry. We don't want to offend anyone. And so we think about, what do people want to hear? And we try to tell them what they want to hear. And I think that doesn't work today. I think what works today is to tell them who you are, what you've done, where you are, what you're thinking, because it's true, and let that go. Some people won't like that. And I'm not talking about intentionally being antagonistic at all. You can say you're from Texas and some people aren't going to like that. I think in the old days, people would say, don't tell them where you're from because some people won't like it. And I think that's the part that has changed. I think people and readers in the audience are just craving for, knowing who people are. Like, who are you actually? And if you tell people what you've done and who you are, you're going to be perceived as more authentic and it's going to just go better in general. And I think the old style just is not going to work at all. And you don't really get any of the benefit of it.
Yeah. And I've often wondered how much of this shift is because we have so much broader reach than we used to. And specifically, I often think when I was much younger, the town you lived in was the town you lived in, and your potential audience was your potential audience. And you either adapted to them or you didn't. And much of the success was being able to adapt to the circumstance. And now people can reach globally across so many, billions of individuals. And there's a little bit more of, I'm just going to put out who I am and let my audience find me, as opposed to me trying to find my audience. And it's a very different way of approaching how we communicate.
I think that's right. But I'd add one other caveat to it, which is this. So I don't know where you grew up, but it sounds like a small town somewhere. Whoever you were in that small town, you could go to the next town and be somebody different and nobody would know. And if you went to California, forget it. You can do whatever you want. What's changed now is, you were talking about the globalness, but you are, wherever you are, people are going to know because they're going to look at where you used to be or who you are. They're going to know people who knew you. So your capability of being different people in different rooms has been eroded. And the people who try to continue to be different people in different rooms get penalized tremendously. And so you have to, I think, in this modern global communication age, be the same person. And where I see this in business as an example is the town hall meeting. Okay, 10 or 15 years ago, companies said, we're going to do town halls. And the idea was you could pull all the employees together and tell them all these things that you wouldn't tell the outside world, but you wanted to build camaraderie and good communication. And that doesn't work anymore because people record it and they post it on YouTube and they tweet about it. And so you can't be one way internally and one way externally. And we've seen this. People still have not reckoned with this. They haven't fully accepted this. But this is why you're seeing companies also, when they're going to do, whether it's earnings or a town hall or any kind of thing, they basically just publish a press release with everything they're going to say. And then they say it. You can decry that as, well, that's a shame, but it is what it is. And I think it relates to this thing we're talking about. You have to be consistent. Yeah. And you can't be consistent if you're lying. You just, at the end of the day, people end up saying, okay, I am who I am. People are going to find me out. So you just sort of start to own it. And we're in this incredibly interesting historical period where people haven't adapted to that yet. I think it's changing the way we communicate, and it will continue to do so.
And I want to come back to that point about addressing different audiences, but still being who you are and being authentic. But I want to come back to a different point first, because it's really interesting when you think about communications departments in companies, because they know storytelling's more important. They know authenticity is more prized. There's lots of time and effort that goes into this. I guess I have a twofold question. One is kind of, what's the state of the art at doing this well for a company? And then how can readers spot when maybe the communications department has learned to fake authenticity really well, if that's even possible?
Again, I think that a lot of communications groups or people think they can shape a narrative, but you can't invent a narrative, I think, is maybe the way you can shape how people think about events. Harder and harder to invent events or deny events or so forth. Talking about corporate landscapes and things that occurred, right? I mean, generally speaking, I think we're in the beginnings of more corporate storytelling. My perception of it is most companies don't do a great job. Most companies haven't really thought of this as, significant. And I think this is largely generational. If you're an older CEO and you grew up in an environment where you're thinking there's no I in team and it's all about performance, you say, our results speak for ourselves. You want to get your message out, but you think, hey, our results speak for ourselves. That's what they say. And that's just not true. Yes, performance is good, but people need to understand to make it really impactful and memorable. You tell a story around it that helps explain it and makes it memorable and makes it something people can share. And I think we're still very early in that. And certainly I think there's a generational thing where older CEOs don't do that as much. Part of the reason is that the storytelling has to have a protagonist. And that protagonist, for the most part, has to be the CEO. Could be somebody else, but generally it's going to be the leader of the organization or company. Generally speaking, I'm very generalizing here, but generally speaking, historically, CEOs have not done that. I'm going to say also on the East Coast, it's less so than the West Coast. You see it more on the West Coast with the Steve Jobs iconography, and you see a lot more communication from some of the people there, particularly in tech, but you see that less in other places. I think the benefits of being visible are overwhelming. And I think generationally, Gen Z, the millennials are going to be much more comfortable with being the protagonist of the story. So we're going to see that happen much more. And there'll come a point where it becomes more normalized. So the way I like to think of it is like right now, if you went to most CEOs and you said, are you out telling your story? Most CEOs, particularly East Coast CEOs, think of telling their story as going on CNBC or going on Bloomberg TV or speaking at an event. And that's one way to do it. They don't necessarily think of it as much as going on podcasts, writing online, doing videos, doing Instagram or whatever. They look at that like that's bizarre. That's not CEO-like, okay? That is going to change in the next 5 to 7 years radically. And we know that because Mark Zuckerberg just did 2 Instagram reels about his latest product announcements. He announced his products on basically handheld iPhone video, like a 3 to 5 minute video that he just talked to the camera, low production quality and so forth, I mean, that's the future. That looks and feels more authentic. It's much faster. It's much more directly speaking to the audience. But, if you're a CEO and you're not used to doing Instagram and used to doing TikTok or writing on Twitter or whatever, that's a scary world, right? That's scary. I look at what Zuckerberg did and you're like, that's what's going to happen. John Gray is another good example from Blackstone. He did a video last earnings call where he's talking about earnings. They posted on YouTube, on LinkedIn. I think it was on X as well. I just think that's where we're moving. We're moving to more of a communication directly from the actor or protagonist, in this case, the CEO, directly to their stakeholders. And that's going to be really interesting, right? Because that direct communication, you can't hide behind anything. You see the person, and some people are good at it, and some people are going to need some training and everything in between. But it's going to be wild to have more access. In the 90s, CEOs weren't on conference calls, like the earnings call. That was delegated to the CFO. That was like beneath them. They were doing vision somewhere, So I just think, broadly speaking, communication is going to be a much bigger part of business and executives' jobs. And the communication has to come in the form of a story to be effective, memorable, and impactful. So that kind of ties it all back. I think that's why we're seeing these trends, because people who create these stories, and they do so particularly directly, are quite memorable. I don't know. I assume you saw the Zuckerberg video of him wakeboarding with the American flag. Pretty powerful, right? So if you're an executive, that's either terrifying or liberating, but it's terrifying.
I wanted to come back to the other point you made because people need to be authentic, but they're also addressing often very different audiences, particularly if you're a CEO. So how does the approach to telling the story change based on your audience? That audience might be composed of investors. It could be your customers. It could be the internal audience at a town hall meeting.
Again, this actually goes back to, I think, largely we're going to see a convergence where you're telling the same stories and giving the same message. And I think we've seen this both in business and politics. The danger of giving one message behind closed doors in private, whether it's a political message or a business message, you can't run that risk anymore. So you have to really think about your messaging and your story and your communication, and then you just are consistent about that everywhere. Where I do see the difference is in a little bit of the vocabulary. or, the style of presentation or so forth, right? When you see Tim Cook talk to investors, it's different than when you see Tim Cook talk to a TikTok influencer. But I think the best practices are going to be deliver the same message and the same ideas, but with different vocabulary. He's going to dress, maybe he's going to wear a suit in one place and he's going to wear khakis in another place. So you're adapting to your audience, but the adaptation is not the message and not the basic information. It's the delivery and the format. So I write on LinkedIn a lot, but a lot of my stories could work on TikTok or Instagram, but they might be a little bit different. Obviously, in TikTok, I would make a video out of it instead of a story. I think that's the way to think about communications is like, what am I trying to communicate to people? And is this audience going to understand, this material, and you shape it that way?
And that technology point is something that I think is really important. So I wanted to dive into that a little bit, particularly to kind of get your thoughts on how technology is changing the nature of how we write our stories and what as readers we value in them, particular social media like TikTok and AI. And maybe if we start with social media, there's just so much content, so much competition for our attention. There's short form video, there's writing, obviously. It's a lot easier to watch a video than to read. And how is this affecting the time and attention people are willing to give to reading? And how must our writing respond to be effective?
Some of it's counterintuitive. So first of all, I think let's realize that because there's no barrier to entry, the volume of what's going to be written is going to increase exponentially. And ChatGPT will contribute to that. But the volume you're talking about, there's a lot to read, there's a lot of volume. Yes, that's going to go up massively. Just like in every other part of the economy, though, you're going to have the same impact you've had in other arenas, whether it's clothing or music or other things. There's vastly more stuff. And then there's a small amount that's really good. And let's just say it's good because it gets attention, whether it's, high quality or not, but people consume that. And it's a bit of a winner take all environment, just like we see in salaries and business and other things. We're going to see a lot more content, but a small amount of it is going to garner the disproportionate amount of attention. And that's an important thing to realize. It's like, if there's 100 pieces of content and you put in 10, you don't get 10% of the audience. You probably get 99 or 0, So I think that the first thing that's happening is there's going to be a lot more content. The second thing is that people are going to really think about competing. If you want to get attention, the content has to be good. Okay? Content has to be good. The second thing I'd say is that there are some general thoughts. Generally people's attention spans are shorter. Lex Friedman's podcast is 3 hours. Joe Rogan's podcast is 4 hours. One of the podcasts recently was 8 hours. The acquired podcasts, these are all like the best podcasts, right? The acquired podcast is 3 or 4 hours. So I think the drive to quality, there are going to be these incredible winners because of the content. So I don't think it's all like you just get shorter, you get long. You produce something that no one else has and it's quite unique, whether because the voice is unique or it has information that's unique. And then that's how you can win. And so there'll be different people in different genres. Some will be long, some will be short, and so forth.
Kind of brings it back to the authenticity point as well of, with these podcasts that can go 3, 4, 8 hours, it's not so much about how am I getting the information most efficiently. It's more about who do I want to spend my time with? Who am I hanging out with?
I do think, though, if we're talking in general, the platforms are changing the way we're writing and pretty radically. I'll give you some thoughts on that. The first is I have like a couple of rules I think about writing effectively online, and I'll tell you what they are. I have like 5 or 6. The first is generally it's got to be short. I write no more than 500 words ever. Part of the reason I write 500 words is because the LinkedIn maximum is 3,000 characters for a post. But also people give me feedback that they'll read that, but they're kind of getting to the end. Like if I kept going, they'd bail. That's like a lot. I don't think I can keep them for longer. So generally you're writing short. Next thing is I think you write fast. And by fast, I mean, there's not a lot of extra words. Just every word is important. You just can kind of browse it and skim it very fast, which is not always the way writing was. The third is it's accessible, meaning they should not have a lot of jargon. It should be like anybody can read this, not just the narrow audience. Then I say it's authentic. Authentic to me online means If you read me, you're like, he wrote that, or he contributed heavily, or he was like deeply involved, or it could not have been written without him, is a way to think about it. Could not have been written without him. If you read something, if I read you and I'm like, wow, and if I could cut and paste it and put somebody else's name on it and no one would know, then that's bad. Okay. That's not authentic. And the last bit for me is educational. Like, it's got to be teach you something, because that's what keeps you coming back. Those things are shaping our writing. And I see it, I mean, particularly online, but I think it's not just about like a platform like LinkedIn. This is about what's written on websites. It's written kind of all over. Like, the language is getting just faster. So another thing is in news writing, which is my background, traditionally you explain everything, right? So you'll say something like Texas, comma, a country the size of France, or you'll always like explain things that are insane, right? You'll just always put in context and background. Okay, so these days you can Google that. And so it's a better use of time to just mention it and not put in the background, because the background really slows down a lot of readers and it makes it ponderous. And so I think one thing that's really dramatically changing, it has not happened yet to most newspapers, but we're going to see a thinning out of what in journalism is called the boilerplate. Okay, the background, the context, the stuff you don't really need, but they put it in to make sure you know how big Texas is.
One thing you said that really resonated with me is you have to write in a style, I think you said skimmable. I often think in my own mind of like scannable. Can someone just kind of like scan down the text and get the major points, and then they kind of decide if they want to go in and really read for the detail? I love the idea of write what only you could have written. It's a great way to not fall into the trap we talked about earlier of trying to write what you think other people want to hear you say or who they want you to be.
I think that's the biggest thing. If you can do that, you're in good shape.
I wanted to get your thoughts on the artificial intelligence side, because I think it leads into that. Obviously, never been easier to write something than it is now with AI. It'll do it for you. And I remember reading a post, I think it was on LinkedIn, when someone asked ChatGPT to write a story in the style of Ted Merz, in your style. And I was curious, how do you think it did? What was your reaction to that? And what do you think it might have missed?
Yeah, so the backstory there, if people don't know, is just that you can take someone's writing and load it into ChatGPT and create a large language model based on that person. And then theoretically, you can give it a command, write a post about Hemingway, and it'll use their style points or whatever. The output is changing very rapidly, so it's constantly changing. We did this, which was, I didn't do it. So someone did it, and then they told me they did it. And that person tried it out. Generally, it didn't work tremendously well. We had to do a lot more prompting. So I don't think it did well, but like that's an area that's just getting better and better. So we'll see how that goes. I think in general, it's interesting. Well, here's what I would say about this. It's my belief that people know when it's written by a computer. There's some confusion about this because sometimes they'll show you a piece and you'll read it and you're like, wow, I can't tell this is written by a computer. People will say things like that. But I mean, we know that's not true. And the way we know that's not true, and I did a lot of this work when I was at Bloomberg, was the clicks and the readership rates and the saves and the shares indicate that people know it's not human or authentic. So when people say, wow, this is really good, they're kind of saying, I can't believe a computer can do this. But they're not really saying it's like a human story. So, technology people may disagree with this, but that's just what we see. We still see, even LinkedIn does analysis of this. And in click rates and share rates and various things, you can see the engagement much greater on human written content. There's usually something that's quite a little wrong about humans. They use different language. You can tell. I think in the long term, large language models, to the degree which they're using training sets based off large volume, they're going to drive towards that medium and they're not going to be quite differentiated. I don't know what the good metaphor for this is, but I don't think it's going to kill writing. I think there's still tremendous opportunity for people to distinguish themselves with writing and storytelling. I think it's more like the evolution of fast food did not kill the Michelin star restaurant. And the evolution of ready-to-wear clothes did not kill haute couture. It's going to be like that. There's going to be a large volume of poorly written stuff. And there's going to be an opportunity for people who write well to distinguish themselves. And keep in mind, distinguishing in the writing isn't just writing, right? A large part of it is the story you pick. Like going back to I picked the Hemingway story. So it's the story selection. It's how you put it together. It's not just literally writing the words. What goes into storytelling is much more than that.
And you said there'll be a proliferation of low quality writing, so to speak. Do you think it'll change what we value in the writing that we read? Do you think it'll make some of the things we've been talking about, like that authenticity, the personal voice, the writers, the human aspects that come through?
I think that's a good point. I think that's very possible. Okay, so like to give you a crazy example, LinkedIn has started doing these things where, like, if you DM me on LinkedIn, they autofill the thing with AI generated text. And the text is always ridiculous. And it's always like, hey, David, it's been a long time since we last caught up. It's super hokey. And so, like, as an example, I have friends who intentionally lowercase everything, i.e. they make a grammatical error to make sure it's clear to you that they're writing that. Because ChatGPT or LinkedIn, the AI in LinkedIn won't let that happen, right? There's things like that we think, yeah, like the writing is never good. Like the AI stuff that they prompt you to communicate with people. I find that very interesting because I don't know if people send you connection requests on LinkedIn, and sometimes they use the AI prompt to say, David, I really admire your work on fill in the blank and like whatever, right? And you're like, it literally makes you not want to connect with that person 100%. Like you're like, maybe you don't connect with them, or at least you think less of them. Don't forget that the point of writing is usually communicating. So yes, these tools can make writing, it can make it more efficient. But if that comes at the cost of the communication, then it's not good. So if you find you can send me an email, you can send a batch of 100 emails with this AI thing, and that's much more efficient than sending out 100 manually. But if all of them reject you because they're like, wow, that's not very personal. He must not really value me. If that's your business, like that's a bad trade-off, right? And I think too many people are thinking, okay, how can this be efficient? But the point, efficiency is good. It's important, but that's not what you're doing here. The point is to connect with people. That's how you get business. That's how you get readers. That's how you become influential. All in all is connecting with people. And if you can't connect with people because you wrote it so efficiently, like it's just a giant waste of time,
Yeah, if your approach led you to communicate that you don't really care to put in the time, that's not what you were intending to communicate.
People who are not chronically online don't necessarily feel that as intensely as people who are, I would say. So people who are like, oh, I have to fill out LinkedIn and I don't do LinkedIn and I'm going to use ChatGPT and write something. And they're like, look, that's awesome. I wrote something. And people who are on a lot and read a lot, they're like, wow, that was written by ChatGPT. And they literally think less of the person. You're trying to build street cred and the opposite is happening,
Well, let me bring it back to human-generated content then, because I wanted to ask you, as a writer, who are your favorite storytellers and who do you look to for inspiration to become a better writer?
In the past year and a half, I've been mainly reading. I mainly read online. I read obsessively online. There's a number of business people who are at the forefront of this, and I think they're quite interesting. And I follow what they do closely. So Rich Hendler from Jefferies is a very active writer on Instagram. And he's like, he's off the charts in authenticity, like he's always interesting, he's just writing what's on his mind, Dan Loeb, a big hedge fund manager, is active on Twitter. He tends to tweet short things. The tech people from the West Coast, Sam Altman, Mark Andreessen, Paul Graham, it's very interesting. They write essays. They'll do these essays. Paul Graham famously wrote an essay, How to Do Good Work. Mark Andreessen is most famous for actually it was an op-ed, but it was an op-ed that said, software is eating the world. That was almost a decade ago. But he's more recently written manifestos about tech and so forth. I think that's very interesting. So I pay close attention to what they're doing because I think they're the future of communication. You asked who's my favorite. It's more like because I'm interested in how they're communicating. And it's not an endorsement per se of like what they say. It's that I think that's the future. We talk a lot about like people want to be a thought leader. And I think what's interesting is that in the past, you could try to be a thought leader without a lot of risk because you just hired somebody to put something in the Times. And this is like a different level. Mark Andreessen, where he's writing online, it's definitely him. And it's definitely like he's putting some strong opinions out there. We're seeing a different kind of communication. It's much more aggressive and so forth. So I find those are really interesting. And then there's just a ton of people who are not as well known. I would say they tend to not so much be in big established companies, but a little bit more on the VC front or the tech front, the founder arena, who have perhaps more agency to say whatever they want. There's fewer lawyers and comms people and whatever, and if they're a founder, it's their company. So there's a ton of people to read on that front. That's the kind of people I'm really interested in how they're communicating and how that's changing.
Well, thanks, Ted. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on who's at the leading edge and how the way we communicate is changing and the role storytelling plays in that. Before I let you go, I wanted to ask you, this is the last episode in our summer playlist series, and you were on it last year. It's become a tradition to ask each of our guests what's on their personal beach reading list this summer. It's Labor Day weekend here in the United States. So before I let you go, I wanted to ask you, what are you reading this summer, Ted?
So I was on last year, so I knew this was coming. I just started a book a lot of people have heard of, Peter Attia, Outlive, and it's The Science and Art of Longevity. So it's a combination of kind of diet, exercise, and what makes us age slower. And I picked it up because I saw him on a podcast. He was talking about his writing and talking about how the book came about and so forth. It inspired me to pick it up. And so it's funny, I'm going from online to, analog.
Well, thanks for sharing the journey with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks again to Ted Merz, founder of Principles Media. We hope you enjoyed the episode. This concludes our series, Summer Playlist 2024. We'll be back next week with our new podcast series, Markets in Transition. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, where trading in centrally cleared, physically deliverable LNG and carbon futures contracts is now underway. Ready for smarter markets? Contact us at onboarding@abax.exchange. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.